All right. Hello, everybody. This is Chet. I'm here for another conversation for the Free Will Project. This time I'm here with my buddy Chris. I'm going to go ahead and let Chris just introduce, who you are, what your background is, and maybe how you came to your perspective on the topic.
So my name is Chris Anderson. I have a little bit of a background in philosophy, especially focusing in on continental philosophy, following in the Kantian tradition. The topic of free will has always been a very interesting one to me. The other side of things is I'm also pretty passionate about social justice and justice reform. And I think that there's a lot of underlying assumptions that really aren't backed by much science in our justice system and could use some radical reform. So this is right up my alley.
Hell yeah. I love it. Let's see. Now, we talked a little bit in chat before this, and you had described yourself as a type of compatibilist.
Yeah.
Now, I have pretty limited exposure to compatibilism. I recently read Daniel Dennett's Elbow Room. Of course, he describes himself as a compatibilist.
Yeah.
But it seems like what you're talking about and what he's talking about are fairly different things.
Yeah.
So yeah, I'm curious what compatibilism means to you.
So, I mean, there's definitely a number of similarities between mine and Dennett's position. Essentially, one of the terms I use to you is like pessimistic compatibilist rather than like soft compatibilism or something. In that, I think that, we often frame, even within compatibilism, choice as being this independent action. And I think rather that everything's layered in many levels of dependencies. And so I just don't think that that is really an adequate framework to address the issue. I think that maybe novel action or novel ideas and things like that, that is the elbow room that I see for choice to be put into, where we stand in relation to a much more predictable mechanical world.
Okay, yeah. That thing you were talking about where like people compatibilists seem to uh, almost cross over into like the more libertarian type language sometimes.
Yeah.
I don't know if there's a term for that. What I've been thinking of it in my head, because I've noticed this too. I've been calling it libertarian drift in my head, um, where like you'll say like, well, of course the world's deterministic, and then it doesn't take very long before you start describing the world as if the metaphysical libertarian position is like what people are operating on. So I feel like that's one of these things that I would like addressed better by like Dennett and folks like that.
Absolutely.
And it sounds like you are addressing that. So like what can you go into that a little bit more? It's tough territory for me. So
Oh, yeah, yeah. So essentially, from a little bit of the quick background of some of the philosophy I'm operating out of, I really agree with the overall framework of choice that Hume puts out, which is essentially, and he's a compatibilist, that choices don't make sense unless there's a structured outcome or a structured limitation to even what possible choices we can make. And then at the same time, having these outcomes mean anything that we can bear responsibility for, the ethical side of the argument, like we need to be active in that choice making. So Hume kind of basically says this ethical stuff only makes sense with both sides of the equation. And I kind of start there, but I think that the amount of human action that actually can be described as meeting those requirements is rather minimal. And it is something that is relatively hard to achieve because as I move like a little forward in time in the philosophical continental tradition of Europe with Kant, we get this idea of synthesis of different ideas, a priori ideas, for example, to come up with concepts that we use to understand and describe the world. And I think that it's through a process of synthesizing new information, novel information, whether it be conceptually, technologically, because obviously if we're going this area, we're going to end up talking a little bit about memes and how these ideas spread, and that sometimes the way to put it is that there's nothing new in human action until a new meme, a new species of idea comes into being. And it is just far rarer than you would think. And there are many philosophy students who think they've come up with a amazing brand new argument, only to find that they've really been synthesizing pieces of arguments they've heard from other people, and that it's been made 100 times before.
Yeah, yeah, I've found that with myself. Uh, Actually, reading Dennett's Elbow Room, I had I had thought I had originally, or maybe I did come up with it originally, but it's not really original. This notion that like, well, if I think I do subscribe to the idea that I'm not particularly responsible for my own individual actions, but I think if that's true, and if I'm actually like part of this larger, more like deterministic process, I don't think it like shrinks my responsibility to nothing. I think more it like expands my responsibility to, I mean, to everything. Of course, that's not like a practical thing, but I think in principle, that's kind of true. And Dennett, if I recall correctly, he said that that's a position that was, I'm going to butcher this, but Sartre. I,
Yeah, so
yeah,
it's about radical responsibility. Yeah.
yeah. So apparently that's not something I came up with, but I think it follows logically. So of course, like you end up in the same position as other people. Um, but yeah, like how does so you're saying that um free will is something that like occurs like in these situations of novelty where something's new? Am I getting that right?
Essentially, yeah, that would be the closest thing that we could describe as what's previously been labeled as free will, because it opens up the room for new choices. Basically, it's a route that before, when everyone had come to that juncture, had a limitation in choice that is now no longer there for this person who's come up with this new idea, whether it be a technological innovation. And that's where we often see structural fundamental changes into the material conditions of humanity, which have a large impact on affecting people's behaviors, especially when we're looking at the realm of criminal justice and, you know, policing these very dumb minor things like low-level drug crimes or vandalism or whatnot. Because at the end of the day, what I'm looking towards is ways in which we can point to human action actually making the change. And of course, like some people, you can still be a hard, determinist and still say like, this is just all part of how it unfolds. But to me, I still want to at least point out to this one little area of the human psyche and the way that we spread information and knowledge as being a potential for liberatory thought and new social possibilities.
That's very interesting. I don't know how to follow that up. That's that's a lot to think about all in one go. Um, yeah, so you did mention interest in like reform in the criminal justice system.
Yeah.
That was one section kind of, I feel like in and I don't mean to like compare everything against Dennett, but I have kind of a limited frame of reference on this. But yeah, when he got to the part where he was describing kind of the legitimacy of the current criminal justice system, like in the context of compatibilism, I was like, and I knew that was his position, but it was painful, like sitting through it, like
Yeah.
sitting through him explain it. I was just not happy.
Yeah.
and so that's another thing that I see with obviously not all compatibilists, but that seems to be a some sort of a common theme in compatibilism, that like, hey, you don't have to throw the baby out with the bathwater, and like all these social institutions that were built on uh, notions of metaphysical libertarianism, like we can still keep them if you just kind of massage the metaphors a little bit, like
Yup.
so like is it your position on free will that informs your desire to reform those institutions, or is it does that come from elsewhere? Like, I know we have similar political leanings, so.
Yeah, I think that like they kind of all come together from a similar basis in and kind of my belief about where human responsibility lies. Because I often also, like when I was younger, often tried to, because I have a lot of physical disabilities that were invisible and undiagnosed for most of my life. And so when I would struggle to keep up with able-bodied individuals, I'd often kind of guilt myself and be like, am I choosing to be lazy, as everyone's saying? And like, am I trying my hardest? And, looking back on it, I can see that a lot of that was just internalized bad thought from our society, our ableist society. And, but at the same time, like, I think that from coming from the existential tradition like Sartre, that the idea that we struggle to like change something in our behavior, that sense of struggle that we feel psychologically or phenomenologically, if we're going to use some bigger $5 terms, that means something in the mind. It's representing some sort of process. And I think, like, kind of being my odd compatibilist position, I think that is significant, but it's not independent, free, like homunculus that's in its own metaphysical world, pulling the strings on some mechanism in a mechanical brain. Rather, I approached a lot of this from a computer science and artificial intelligence standpoint of looking at, well, what would it take a computer to have independent thinking and be able to adapt and come up with new things, and along the road using the human mind as a kind of a basis for this, because it's the only real model that we have a good grasp on. And to me, it seems that what kind of makes us our ability to make choices about the future somewhat significant is that we are making little models in our head of potential paths and outcomes. We're little simulators. And of course, there are degrees of accuracy and number of variables that we're considering, but it's in that when you introduce a new concept into that, we can conceive of a new potential set of outcomes. And that, a learning artificial intelligence that we could describe as having a responsibility for its actions, in a sense, be held accountable, or at least be pointed to as something other than just the raw code, maybe like say it's the programmer's fault, but rather something that is doing stuff on its own. And to me, that's kind of where I jumped into, well, how are people doing this, and like kind of what is its significance? Because I had always been more in this compatibilist range of agreeing on some level with the baby in the bathwater thing, that like obviously saying that, Hitler was just part of the course of history and the Nazis, and that like everything they did was just the way history had to unfold. But then at the same time, like I don't really think that most human behavior is a result of so much choice, but rather what we have been given. And that's another element of this synthesizing new ideas, is that you can't build new ideas out of clay or material you don't have. It has to be built up from pre-existing ideas or smaller ideas, and we synthesize something new. And it's in that synthesis that unique, novel things can begin.
That's, yeah, the Hitler bit's like a hard pill to swallow. Like,
Yeah.
That's, well, and it really does challenge your intuitions of like morality, if you think that something like that was like fated to occur or something like
Yes.
that. It's yeah, difficult to swallow. And I don't know, I'm still of the mind that I mean, I'm sure you're familiar with these words, but I would definitely draw a distinction between like determinism and fatalism.
Oh yeah.
I generally don't think things are just destined to occur.
Yep.
But I do think we're all, and I think you agree, like we're all in this sort of causal process that certain outcomes, they seem to follow logically from previous conditions. So I don't know how to like square all the details of that, but I think a lot of people, whenever they hear about determinism, they're afraid of fatalism.
Yeah.
And to me, that's like an important one to address, to be like, no, there's still reason to like get up in the morning and put your pants on or whatever, to get things done. I mean, things aren't going to get themselves done.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely. You kind of, by accepting the idea of fatalism, you alter your whole behavior set, and so then you change what the outcome of all your behaviors will end up being if you just sit around doing nothing all the time. So
right.
yeah.
Yeah. You mentioned memes, and it's like, fatalism is a meme with consequences, right?
Yep.
And so yeah, if that, which at the same time, if you really think about it, it would be pretty hard to do nothing. Like it would be a real challenge to actually go through your days, and I mean, pretty soon the rest of your environment's going to start kicking you into action one way or another. Like,
Oh, absolutely. And as someone who's been disabled, especially like largely out of work for the past 10 years, there's been times where like, yeah, because of health reasons, I've been practically bedbound doing next to nothing. And it drives you mad. There is a need to like, express yourself, do something. Your mind has to stay preoccupied, and especially if you have a chronic pain condition, if you're not preoccupying yourself at all, you just fixate on the pain. And I think that we often, especially when we look at issues of welfare and social help, we think that like, oh, if we provide all these basics for people, like if they had all their food and everything paid for, they just all sit around smoking weed all day. And like, I have to medicate myself for pain, and like, I still feel like I want to get things done. Like I've taken on a lot of my own projects. I raise chickens. Like there's a number of things that make me feel fulfilled, and no one, like, I mean, maybe if you're burnt out and you have just no energy left, a couple weeks of doing next to nothing might sound good. But after that, even then, it starts to drag on you psychologically and you get depressed. And like, there is a lot that pushes us forward, even when we think that like, oh, you could just be so easy to do nothing.
oh yeah, no, I was off because of coronavirus. I was off from work for, I don't remember the exact dates, but it was a few months. And yeah, kind of like you said, like I'm kind of just exhausted from work all the time, and so yeah, the first couple of weeks were pretty pleasurable. Played a lot of video games,
Yep.
and I mean, even then, I didn't actually literally do nothing. I did things, but yeah, I wasn't like in the conventional sense. I wasn't like real productive for a couple of weeks there.
Yeah.
And yeah, it didn't take very long before I started like, I'm learning Spanish now, because I was like, fuck, I gotta find something to do.
Yep.
I've picked up a couple, I've started this project now.
Yeah.
And it's just like, it is human nature to desire some sort of creative outlet, to
Hmm.
to to want to perform in some way, even if it's not like a traditional notion of performance, to
Yep.
want to engage with your environment in some fashion. And yeah, this, you've seen my gazillion posts on Facebook about basic income.
Yeah.
This is like one of the most common objections to it, is like, oh, if you give people money, they won't do anything. And it's like, well, first off, like, you're telling me like you're basically like coercing people to work with threat of like starvation and homelessness, which is pretty fucked to begin with.
Oh yeah.
but but like on top of that, it's just not true. I changed my cover photo recently to a quote from David Graeber, because he recently
Yeah.
passed.
Yeah.
And that's just a huge loss. He was
Oh,
one of
absolutely.
he was one of my big inspirations.
Same here.
um,
He was
but
a great
yeah,
guy.
he was basically saying in the quote that, everyone assumes this, but it's actually not true. Like, speaking as an anthropologist, everything we know about humans is that they can't sit around and do nothing. Like, that's
Yeah.
that's just, you know, for a bunch of people that claim to understand human nature, like these people don't really seem to understand like how people work. And yeah, to me that's a big one. It's like it seems like the countries with, you know, the most generous welfare programs, they seem to have better social health outcomes, and they don't have these problems of people like sitting around doing nothing, just like, oh my god, everyone's going to be strung out on drugs and blah blah blah. That's some kind of you know, Protestant work ethic
Yes.
fantasy. It doesn't have anything to do with reality. It has to do with like internalized guilt that some people are carrying around.
Oh, absolutely. And along the lines of like, providing extra money, my disability money basically just barely covers kind of my general living and medical expenses. So when I got my stimulus check this past round, that allowed me to uh, to be able to get 16 chickens, which is now with my parents' chickens up to 22 in my flock.
Hell
Um,
yeah.
but like, to get just the lumber materials and things like that, that's normally outside of my budget. Um, and there's a lot of things that I would love to like have started, years ago as projects, but simply because of my limited income from disability, the fact that there's a $2,000 amount of like cap on how much money I can have saved up, like
Right.
you kind of get trapped into this level of poverty. And then on top of it, on the psychological phenomenological end, and I've been there, where especially if you're dealing with food insecurity, this is where I've noticed the most in my life. You end up fixating and spending at least, and I've seen a number of scientific studies, around like 30% of your brain power and time throughout the day just thinking about like, the variables involved in getting your next meal and what could go wrong. And that is really like, that will make you do nothing, kind of being stuck in, especially if you have an anxiety disorder. And my health things kind of kicked up a number of anxiety things. My autonomic nervous system's all funky. And so like, it's just, if we actually opened up that room where people weren't worried about the basics, then like you'd see them be doing even like even further with any additional help that they get, because then they're thinking about these longer term projects, like raising a flock of chickens or whatever. Like now I'm cutting down on like the amount that I rely on the system, because I'm getting over half dozen eggs a day right now. So you know it's just one of those things where people need to have the resources, and that's where I believe that responsibility implies one has the power to do something, and that the power to do something means like you have the responsibility of the outcome, to what was at least predictable. And I think that I'm getting off track here, but just essentially that we need to be able to conceive of the future to be able to build something up to it. And if we're constantly trapped in the moment by, well, poverty and other worries, then we're not going to be able to fulfill our full desires and express our full, like, the human nature to self-express and create.
Man, it sounds like that money made you real lazy. It sounds
Honestly,
like, man, we can't be handing out money. People are going to be starting their own projects and raising chickens and cutting down on the government subsidies. Like, this is
yup.
terrible, man. We gotta no, and that's something, I've been on public assistance myself, for periods of time. Just, things are rough from time to time,
Yep.
and man, it was not a treat. Like, it was not.
Yeah,
It
never
was
is.
rough, and there really is. You mentioned the $2,000 limit and all the strings attached. Like, it it really is frustrating how in this country we can't seem to get our act together on just like basic like solidarity with our neighbors, and just
Yep.
understanding that, like, people are better off when their needs are fulfilled. And
Yeah.
when we don't do that, we're asking for trouble. Like, and
Yes.
that's just a biological truth. The stuff you were talking about with scarcity, it reminded me the whole area of scarcity psychology. um, I can't remember the other dude's name, but Sindhil Mullainathan was the one that wrote the book on scarcity psychology, and
Yeah.
had the studies that showed, like, some of the, I think they were Indian farmers, that between uh, harvest and planting, like it was their wealthiest time of year to the point of the year where they had like nothing, and
Yep.
as their test scores would come out as much as like a 13-point gap in their IQ in
Yep.
between those. I mean, within a year, like, and I mean, I know IQ is, what does IQ measure? Who knows? But it measures something,
Yeah,
and
when it's the same person to the same person, there's at least something there.
something's being measured. Like
Yeah.
it's not the be all end all measurement of like human intelligence, but it's something. And yeah, when you have that kind of fluctuation in the span of a year, it's like, what are we doing to ourselves by like keeping people in this like chronic condition of scarcity? It does reduce your ability to think about the future. It creates like a sort of an immediate concern about just like how's tomorrow going to get taken care of. You can't.
Yep.
This is one of the problems I run into whenever, I really enjoy a lot of futurist thinking, and a lot of people that kind of fancy themselves as futurists, or some don't, present themselves that way, but I think they're, kind of future oriented thinkers.
Yeah.
A lot of times these people are talking about events that are predicted to happen in, on the span of decades, or
Hmm.
maybe even centuries or something like that.
Yep.
If you talk to the average person, about something that's going to happen 5 years from now, they don't care. They don't like, they can't, there's no frame of reference for caring about things that are not relatively immediate. And I think a lot of this has to do with that scarcity mentality, and also just we're not really trained to think that way. It's kind of a skill you develop, but I think there's a component there where we're so much of this country is just like a missed paycheck away from homelessness.
Yeah.
We're not comfortable enough to actually imagine like a future worth having, and it's a
Well,
real tragedy.
yeah, it really is. No, and it definitely affects like addressing longer term issues like climate change, because up until the last, I would say, like, in the last 8 years, there's been enough freak climate events that I've seen even people who were pretty hard denialists at least being like, oh, this is freaky. But it's only in that moment during the storm or right after the storm. And there's just people not seeing that like that is part of this growing trend. And to be able to be concerned about what is the planet going to be like a generation from now, like conceiving of how humans could inhabit a planet that is significantly hotter, where we've had mass die off, like it's obvious why it's anxiety inducing, but at the same time, like it needs to be grappled with. And so, I think for a long time, like, obviously it's a very big issue with Gen Z kids, but they were there was a while where a lot of people were going kind of like, YOLO, fuck it, we're all going to die anyways. But like, at the end of the day, like that is corrosive to our ability to confront these problems, which are dire. And we need to be able to unite and mobilize and get people motivated to address these issues. And if everyone's still focusing on their next meal, that's never going to rise to the top of one of our priorities.
Yeah, that's something I've definitely tried to grapple with over the last couple of years. Is like the importance of addressing our ecological problems on the psychological level.
Yes.
Like these things are not separate. We're all part of this systemic process that's unfolding, and I think a lot of times, people see things like that as abstract. I remember maybe it was like 2015 or so, and Bernie was in the primaries, and he said something that shouldn't have been controversial, but it just demonstrates how poor we are at thinking about systems. He was talking about the relationship between climate change and terrorism.
Oh.
And this, of course, he became like the laughing stock of the right, because they're like, "Whoa, Bernie thinks climate change causes terrorism," and it's like, no, there's a real relationship. Like this, I found the Department of Defense study that he was referencing, and it's like, this is real shit. Like this is, I mean, the Department of Defense, these aren't like far lefties, right? This
Oh
isn't a
yeah.
conspiracy theory. These are like super establishment figures giving hard analysis on the situation that at least they consider to be objective, right? They're not operating on at least like an overt ideological bias. You could argue there's all kinds of institutional bias there, but yeah, the Department of Defense had pointed out that no, there's a serious relationship between climate change and terrorism.
Yeah, I
And
think
yeah, go
the
ahead.
particular example was Syria, and that there had been a major drought prior to the Syrian civil war, which had forced a lot, like most of the farmers, like beyond just poverty, but they were like abandoning, their land, and that this giant, started with no rain, then no food, and then the economy takes a hit, and then the government can't meet any of its expectations, and then it responds with force to demands, and things spiral. And we, it's amazing that people don't see that, like, these large pressures on society could actually trigger something as violent as terrorism, and not see that bigger picture. But like you said, like, and we mentioned earlier the issue of concision, that no one wants to watch 2 hours long of explanation of the long systemic interconnected issues, but rather, like, people want to turn on the nightly news and get a 30-second segment that quickly covers it and then moves on.
Oh yeah, and they want their biases confirmed too.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
They don't they don't want to hear anything that's like objective. They want to they want to hear why the other side's crazy. Uh,
Yep.
yeah, it's frustrating, and I think just I feel like the US is just kind of the epitome of this problem, that we're so stuck in this trap, and this sort
Yeah.
of psychological scarcity of not understanding how systems work and all this. And we're probably, I don't have objective information on this, but my intuition is that free will, of the libertarian sort, is most popular here.
Yeah.
It's certainly the impression I get, because most of the time, if you even bring up the subject here at all, uh, you're you're gone. Like nobody wants to even engage. No one
Yep.
can even comprehend what you're saying. It's really offensive. It's more offensive than a lot of things you can say about people's like economic or religious beliefs or things like that.
Mhm.
It's a deep deep component of the way we view the world, is that we're it's the individual that's authoring their actions, and all individuals must be uh, held completely account to everything that comes out
Yep.
of their behavioral situation. And I don't even know where to begin, other than like, I thought basic income was a good decent reform to kind of kickstart some sort of movement on
Yeah.
this deep problem of psychological scarcity. And of course, there's a lot of other ways to address it too. But even having conversations about it, I think can help. I think if people are given the tools to even like question themselves on that level, that in itself is a type of gain. So
Yeah.
I don't know. Hopefully, there's something there. Um, just to kind of tie back to something you said earlier, you had mentioned that when you were, I believe you said when you were in high school, and you were kind of like competing with other people in physical activities and stuff
Yeah.
like that, like some of this sort of libertarian narrative had been like internalized, and it
Yep.
actually like contributed to suffering, which you might not have experienced otherwise. To me, this is like one of the big problems is we've growing up, I think we all internalized that message a little bit.
Yep.
and it does cause suffering. I think, needless suffering that shouldn't exist in the world, and that doesn't contribute anything.
I mean,
Um,
it's less than even it doesn't contribute to anything. There's a lot of studies out there that suggest that, like, by internalizing that guilt and actually believing that, like, we are worthless or we're not as good as like our peers, we then don't act as much. We start believing it, and then we stop trying at things, and it is actively harmful to continue to spread these beliefs.
yeah, I think so. I think it's just something that we shouldn't have to deal with. I
Yeah.
think it's something we'd be much better off correcting. I also think it's one of these things. I don't know if you're on the same page with me as this. I think you are, but um, the, we really like beating children in this country.
Yeah.
we we really like to take that notion of responsibility and kind of flip it around to be like, well, the only way to teach you responsibility is to physically abuse you.
Yeah.
And this is a serious problem in this country. I think more so than a lot of developed countries. I think there's some places in Europe that spanking is basically non-existent,
Yeah.
or at least
It's
very
child
taboo.
abuse. Yeah.
Yeah, and I'm thinking, this is yet another way in which, if we could understand that, the way to correct behavior is not just to reach for like physical abuse, but rather to understand how our bodies learn, how our
Mhm.
bodies as a system like adjust to new information and such.
Yep.
We'd be able to bring kids up in a way that they are better off for it, because the physical abuse has long-term implications and often
Yeah.
creates cycles and whatnot.
Yes.
So yeah, that's one thing, one implication I see that's like really big. If we could get this conversation more mainstreamed, maybe we would just have in general like a better understanding of how to correct our behavior. And
Yeah.
I guess that kind of folds into the criminal justice issue, because that's just
Yes.
spanking for adults.
Yep.
it's,
Absolutely.
it's really no no it makes no more sense than spanking children, which in my understanding psychology lines up on like entirely one side. There's like uh basically just like some cranks out there that advise
Yeah.
spanking your children, and
A lot of
otherwise,
people connect to the evangelical movement,
yeah.
really, from what I've seen.
um Yeah, I believe I was watching a lecture where George Lakoff mentioned that James Dobson is one of these people that advises like hitting your child as like an infant or something like that. Like, I
Oh my
mean,
God.
real early. Like,
Yeah.
I mean, it doesn't make it any better if you wait till they're older, but man, like I can't imagine internalizing that information and thinking like, well, I'm making the right choice here. It hurts me
Yeah.
more than it hurts you. It's like, dude, you're beating an infant. Like,
Yeah.
it's disturbing.
The,
Um,
the the like the full extent of that logic is like classical conditioning works, and it's just like not if the thing doesn't conceive of what it's doing or what's around it, like, and even as it does, like, that's why explaining, like, as a child gets older, what was wrong, why people were upset, like,
right.
that is much more effective at altering behavior than just a simple fear of punishment.
Yeah, I think it a lot of it, George Lakoff talks about like the strict father psychological model.
Yep.
And I think a lot of it has to do with that and these notions that human nature is evil because some woman ate a piece of fruit a long time ago.
Yep.
Wild ideas like that. And yeah, it really, these ideas end up manifesting themselves in really destructive ways in the world. I think I went off on a tangent there, but what I was getting at is, do you have any like prescriptive ideas for what an ideal uh, criminal justice system would look like, or would it even look like a criminal justice system at all? Would it look like something entirely different?
I mean, I think for the large part, it's more of an issue of addressing mental health and material conditions.
Oh yeah,
and that there might be, some cases of people who have violent antisocial behaviors, and who knows what the underlying thing could be. It could be tumor, brain damage, whatever it is. And those people might need, just like someone who's a severe case of Alzheimer's or something like that, they might need some sort of supervisory role, and just like in these hospitals, they need someone who can physically restrain you if you're a threat to yourself. But at the same time, it doesn't need to be oriented around punishment. Rather that, like, for the safety of themselves and others, we need to be treating those things. And I think more often than not, most of these issues are best addressed at the material conditions level. And, like drug addiction is a good example, something that we like very much criminalize and just try and prosecute our way out of drug addiction in this country. But, and I remember hearing the study about, the rats and the cocaine or heroin or whatever it was in their water.
Yeah, Rat Park.
Yeah, exactly. When they were just in a little tiny cage, overcrowded, they all got hooked, and it eventually killed them. But then they made the giant, amazing thing where the material conditions, where they were able to get all the food they needed, they had all the space, so they weren't feeling crowded. They stayed entertained. There were enough things in there for them to do. That then you ended up getting what being the more biochemical sign of, which was like roughly 5% of the rats were getting hooked, and that's because of dopamine sensitivity, and that kind of follows in with a lot of mammals, about 5%. And that's what you also see with like historically with a lot of like opioids or heroin, is whatever, about 5% of the population will end up hooked on a lot of things like that. But right there, you're seeing right there, that's a biological response. Like that's a dopamine thing, and throwing these people in jail is not going to change how their body, responds to dopamine.
Oh, they just need a spanking. That's all they need.
Yeah,
Like,
yeah, maybe and then they'll get a kink because it's dopamine. But whatever.
oh Jesus, that I don't know what to say. But yeah, no, the Rat Park study is like super fascinating, and it's one of these things that demonstrates the power of environment, and it should really cause us to question our environment now, like how we have society set up, like the kinds of institutions we have, the punitive measures we inflict on people. And I don't know, maybe everyone will hear about Rat Park because of this conversation, and then we'll change the world.
I hope so. Honestly, I think that one study alone should reshape everyone's opinion about at least addiction.
Right. Yeah. And so much of addiction, there's what is it? The term is escaping me at the moment. Adverse childhood experiences.
Yes.
This notion in psychology of like, the trauma that's inflicted upon you as a child. There's a definite relationship between people having drug problems later on in life and being abused earlier in life. And so much of who we are, a lot of people like to lean too hard on the genetics to explain who we are, but there's a definite anchor, like early on in life. You get a lot of who you're going to be from the experiences you have early on. And so that's something, once again, like we should probably stop beating children because we're making them more aggressive and less cooperative and more confrontational and whatnot. So
we have enough medical science to know that there's brain lesions too accompanying all that, and I don't know how anyone on the right could defend inflicting brain lesions as helping development, but they'll probably just sidestep that question.
Yeah, it builds character, right? They're character lesions.
Character.
I'm so sorry. I apologize to everyone watching. I didn't mean it. But yeah, at some point I meant to get into the question of like, you had this experience early on, and you're like feeling some internal like guilt or frustration, and you're like questioning your own motivation, and obviously that relates to a sort of libertarian metaphysical libertarianism that we all get indoctrinated with is
Absolutely.
it's pretty universal in our society. You're a lucky kid if you didn't get that one.
Oh, yeah.
But yeah, so how did that affect your life? And as your worldview changed, like what is it like on the inside to like go through that sort of transformation, a change in understanding, and how does that affect how you talk to yourself?
Yeah. Well, on one level, before I even get to the internalized discussion, my condition that I have is Ehlers-Danlos Syndrome, and it basically means my connective tissue, especially things like my joints, are just messed up. I was also born with this from the small of my back down, all the discs in my back were fused. And so, for example, I'd often, when I did cross country as a kid, the thing that would stop me wouldn't be my fatigue or my legs, it was my lower back. And I did have a coach notice it one time, but not enough to really like get it investigated. But you know, overall, I pushed myself too hard and did damage on my body because I shouldn't have been trying to keep up with able-bodied people. I did martial arts for a number of years, and it's the only place that I can think of, but I ended up having, I've had 6 abdominal hernia surgeries in my life. In fact, I have a plastic mesh sewn over my whole abdomen to help hold it together, really. And the only place I can imagine doing that was in martial arts. And it's just another one of these examples of where like my body was, when I was getting this thought of I should stop, it was my body telling me you should stop because you're doing damage.
Right.
And then this internalized thought from outside of like only like losers quit. And then I'm like trying to push myself through to it. And now that like I'm, you know, in my 30s, like that damage I did to my body, I am really feeling. And there are so many other people I've met with my condition who, you know, tried to continue with athletics when they were young and did serious significant damage to their body. And, you know, and it's a condition that most people don't get diagnosed with until they're an adult. So you've already done a ton of damage before the doctors even come in and say like, oh, that was a bad idea.
Yeah, why'd you do that, kid? What were you thinking? It's like I
Yeah.
was thinking what I was told to think. Jeez. Like,
And for me now as an adult, those limitations have become a lot more significant with my disability. Particularly, I have a condition, POTS, autonomic dysfunction, but it essentially means that I get these flares that affect my blood pressure and can leave me bedbound and cause things as weird as non-mentally induced panic attacks. So I thought I was actually developing paranoid schizophrenia when I first started developing these symptoms, because panic
wow.
attack out of nowhere, thinking of nothing. But I have to really kind of balance how hard I push myself. If I push myself too far, I kick my autonomic nervous system to produce like a little bit too much adrenaline, fight or flight side, and this thing kind of just goes like a pendulum. It can't stick in homeostasis. And
Right.
so I've had to learn that when my body is telling me these things, I listen, and that like I need to not push myself unless it's like in a scenario where I'm like, okay, push myself for a few hours here, and then I'm going to have 3 days where I'm useless and doing nothing. That's the only scenario in which pushing beyond what my body's telling me is healthy is worth it. And so now I just feel like, you know, I see it as me effectively managing my condition. And I've learned a lot of lessons, and I've tried pushing it. And I just know that to accomplish the maximum I can over, especially a longer period of time, it's not worth it. And to me, it's just become a very much a kind of black and white health issue that like there's no benefit. And I think
Yeah.
that with people who are healthy and able-bodied, we don't often think about what the physical effects and then what follows that psychologically. Like if you knock your sleep cycle off or whatever, and then like I've seen just very small things knock people into cycles of depression, and it's simply often because we are told to push ourselves further and further, often to generate profit, to go to work, do these things, when like, you know, if they could, they'd work us to death, and they often do. The 40-hour work week is an amazing thing. You know, it's amazing that we have that, but there are a lot of people, especially those with like any who aren't in perfect health, that even 40 hours is a lot for them. And you know, in this age of like, you know, often overproduction of things and COVID and so forth, like we could very well cut back hours, scale things up, scale things back a little bit, and divide, you know, shift duties and stuff around, as long as people knew they were getting still the amount of, you know, required to get by, the resources. And
Right.
instead, we're still trapped in this old economic model. And it is interesting, and you know, I do definitely appreciate that. Like, you know, the longest person that I've talked about UBI with online has been you, because you've been involved in sort of talking about these issues for a very long time. And I always thought, like, you know, this was another tool to use for addressing many of these social problems.
Absolutely.
And I wasn't sure if it was going to be one that really took off with popularity. I had some hope, considering that in the 70s with the negative income tax, it had already been something that had been popularized to some degree. And being a market-based solution, Americans are a lot more find it palatable. But at the end of the day, like you know, this past year has been pretty incredible for the issue, because we got, you know, Andrew Yang, the dark horse candidate, making it to being like, you know, near the end of the primary season, and completely popularizing the idea, very focusing on it and bringing it up over and over. And then right after he's out of the race, COVID hits really bad. And then in order to save the economy, they have to do a UBI measure. And every other country that is economically weathering this a little bit better than us kind of just made it a really strong UBI that was continual. And America was just like, oh, we don't want to pay for, you know, poor people getting money, so we're going to do it just a one-time thing, and just, you know, maybe we'll do something later.
I think in a very unfortunate way, this last year has been like incredible evidence, uh, just for the fact that we should be giving people money. Like,
Yeah,
it's yeah, and you know, the things you said about reducing the work week, like, there's been studies that have shown like you get the same amount of productivity out of a 6-hour workday as you do an
yeah,
8-hour workday, because people are being overworked. Those last couple of hours aren't really productive anyways.
yeah,
A lot of times, if you give people less time to complete a task, they'll just take less time to complete it.
yep,
It's just a fact that the work tends to get stretched out if you're given a longer time. Like, anyone that's ever written a paper for school,
yeah,
you know that like you're gonna take the amount of time to write that paper that you're given. You don't run
yep,
home and write it on the first evening,
no,
um, unless you're just some kind of super student, in which like, get out of my face, like,
yeah,
I don't want to hear about that. But uh,
yeah. If they do exist, they should not set the standard.
yeah, yeah, stop making me look bad here. but but yeah, like, there's and you know, there's one of the big themes with the Yang campaign, and something stuff that I've been on for years. You know, I've been ranting about this stuff, the effects of automation,
Yep,
and how automation can be employed to
yeah,
replace a good deal of what we do already.
absolutely.
There's no reason we couldn't cut the work week in half or even shorter. And you know, John Maynard Keynes, what, like, in the 1930s, I think, wrote the paper "Economic Possibilities for Our Grandchildren."
Yeah,
He was talking about the 15-hour work week,
yep,
and that was going to happen by now, and
yeah,
it could have happened by now. There's no technical reason this shouldn't happen, but we have these cultural hangups about like individuals needing to earn their place in society, and people needing to perform, like you said, to produce profit. You know,
yeah,
if your contributions aren't contributing to GDP, well then they don't matter.
yeah,
Meanwhile, the most valuable work in our society, a great deal of it doesn't contribute anything to GDP,
hmm,
and we'd be up shit creek if it stopped happening.
oh,
So, like,
absolutely.
you know, billions and billions of dollars worth of free labor people contribute every year, and yeah, I don't know exactly where I'm going with this, other than We should just stop having this super strict notion of what productivity means.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm getting a sign that says the internet connection's unstable, so that's great. Uh, but yeah, we really need to rethink what it means to contribute, especially in the light of our growing understanding of neuroscience and biology, and just understanding that people are basically products of, you know, the genetic dispositions that they inherit and the environment that shapes them.
Yep.
And it's like, how are you going to say someone deserves like less than living wages if objectively you understand that they didn't create their situation and they really don't author their individual performance? And it's really our shared responsibility to correct the conditions that create any sort of problematic behavior.
Yeah.
If that's the situation, how can we justify poverty? We can't. Like, it's
Yeah, not at all.
wrong. Poverty's wrong. It's
Yep.
immoral. It's inefficient. It's
Yep.
all, you know, there's all kinds of problems with it.
It gives leverage though, and I think above all that's what the rich love is, that when you have nothing you have no leverage. And like it's part of why, you know, unions have been so important to the working classes, because collective, it's same thing of like, you know, when you go to like argue with a hospital by yourself, it's really hard to get them to change any bills. But if like you're a big insurance company representing like, you know, 10,000 patients, like they'll have a closed door meeting with you. You know, you have to have that leverage to get people to listen, and it often, you know, we have to do it collectively.
Yeah, unfortunately, it's a very stratified power system that we live within. And yeah, if you're just an individual at the bottom, you, your voice doesn't mean too much. It really is important that we gather together and work
Yes.
collaboratively towards change, and not just complain.
Yeah.
And that's not to say complaining doesn't have its place. Like, I don't know, I do a lot of complaining, so
Yeah. The constructive and deconstruct, or you know, creation and destruction, they're both required.
right. I like it. Um, let's see. The last question I had on the list was, how did your change in your point of view to the sort of point of view you have now, how did that change any sort of meaning that you find in life? And also, uh, did that process cause you any anxiety, or did it relieve anxiety? Like, how did it, how was the experience? How did it feel?
Um, well, I had a lot of anxiety when I was first coming to accept the full limitations of what existed in my life, and it just happened to be a little bit further. I was further limited than I even imagined because of my health. And I was hoping to do a lot more higher level academic things, but I knew that at the same time, with a little bit of my background in existential philosophy, that we choose and help create what we find meaningful, and what gives us that sense of contributing. And you know, there were a long number of years that it took me to reshape an idea of what that would look like for me. But you know, taking every day to be more intentional with the relationships we have, and for me, keeping my stress low was a big part of managing my condition. And I found that I was a very competitive person before. Like, my idea of relaxing was putting on punk or metal music and playing shooter video games. Until I realized I had a doctor or a therapist be like, that's not relaxing because your heart rate never goes down. And I was like, oh shit, yeah, I guess you're right.
Damn, called
And
out by
so,
science.
yep. And so I had to learn like things that actually helped my my parasympathetic nervous system to relax and digest, and you know, keep me from being on this anxiety fight or flight side. And so, you know, taking care of the chickens is one of these things I love. Doing things like, you know, taking care of plants and gardening, And that's where like I've really seen that like focusing on life and living things and relationships, um, you know, it doesn't add up always to something huge for the world around you, but those are meaningful actions, and those are things that like I choose to center my behaviors around. I think that, you know, we often are taught to, especially high performers, a lot of us millennials who were told like the sky's the limit, that we're not going to be happy until we achieve something that just like shakes the whole world, and that everyone knows our name or something like that. And often, you know, it is the much smaller things, the closer relationships, all that ends up mattering more, um, in the longest perspective that I can see in my head, than chasing a rat race. And
Right.
that's where I found a lot more peace in my life, coming to accept that and finding that, you know, I just have to do what's best for me and my health, and that pushing things and meeting other people's expectations is only going to hurt me.
That's beautiful.
Well, thank you.
So we've been going for close to an hour here. So I'm going to go ahead and start wrapping up.
Okay.
Was there anything that you wanted to get out that I missed? Because we do have time.
You know, like other than just maybe like delving a little bit on the mimetic side of how, like I guess jumping forward, that since new ideas are a rare thing that you know that are synthesized, and that more, it seems to me that of memes of significance, few people really ever synthesize one in their life. They often will have ones of a more localized significance, but like something that completely alters the way that people can see society or social relations, and like revolutions and all these sorts of big changes. That is a, you know, the probability of that happening is, you know, it's infinitesimal. But at the same time, because it's still part of this driving process of how humans interact with these ideas, and we make them and synthesize them. We're all learning. All children are always synthesizing new information. New stuff, novel things do get created. And that it's in picking up these new ideas that we also expand other people's, by spreading these new concepts, that other people open up their horizons as well for possible action. And I think like an example would be like a kind of class consciousness or political consciousness that goes beyond just what the news media tells us, which is the fullest extent of political engagement is going to the ballot box in November, and then that's the end of it. But rather, like, you tell people that, like, oh, you know, that like just feeding some of your neighbors and stuff, that's political action too. Like, you know, you open up people's horizons, and then new behaviors and choices start to emerge.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, the sort of, I don't know, mimetic side of all this. It's really fascinating. That was something else I wanted to ask you about. Um, so obviously you find some value in the concept of free will.
Yeah.
So like on I guess it's kind of on the mimetic level, like what does that accomplish that might otherwise not be accomplished without it?
Um, I think that,
Or in other words, what am I throwing out? What's the baby that goes
oh,
out with the bathwater?
if,
Because personally, I don't feel that, but I know other people do feel that, and I don't think we all have to have like the same sort of like, you know, coherent hive mind worldview. If other people are like utilizing other memes and it improves their quality of life and such, like, I mean, who am I, right?
yeah.
Uh, but yeah, so I'm just kind of curious, what does that accomplish for those of us that do accept determinism, but still find free will to be a meaningful concept?
Um, I think that it, I mean, on one level, we can regain a appreciation for novelty, that there is something special to it, even if it was a result of causal events. And I think that you end up throwing out holding people responsible for so much small action, but at the same time, it doesn't write them out of the picture as an agent. Agency still exists. And that often we are driven by drives that push us in a certain direction, and that these newer ideas will help our will to shift our priorities and focus. And that's where I see that sense of struggle being expressed or represented from the mind, is that it's a shift in behavior set that the will is applying to a conceptual schema based on this new idea it's putting into the schema.
Interesting.
Little abstract, but
hey, that's all right. Well, man, I appreciate your time so much. Are there any like projects or things you're up to, or things you'd like to draw attention to that you wanna plug before we get off here?
Oh, you know, people just need to go out there and find their neighbors and find, just help out people. You know, and if there's a lot of people out there right now that are getting shot, for example,
Oh,
you know,
Jesus,
by
yeah.
police and things like that, like, please go out there and just be active in your community and helping your neighbors, even if you haven't ever met them before. You know, find social groups. I'm not going to plug any particular one. I'm a member of a lot of them, but, you know, go out there, just start meeting people.
Yeah, no, that's something I feel like you know, pre-internet and pre-television and pre a lot of these like mass communication technologies, you know, all there was community.
Yep.
Like you couldn't help but be connected to the community in one way or another. And now you know, we're in these sort of like you know, techno jails or something where we're so isolated.
Yep.
And it's one reason why I wanted to have these conversations face to face, because I think it just helps I don't know, maybe not entirely recreate a sort of sense of conversation,
Yeah,
but I think it does something better than like text only communication does.
definitely.
So yeah, there's all kinds of brilliant organizations out there to join. Definitely engage with your community. It's fulfilling, and it helps other people. You're making the world better. You're making yourself better. It's the way to be. Chris, thank you so much for your time. I'm not going to take any more of it. But yeah, if anyone's curious, the Free Will Project has a group on Facebook. It's a private group, but if you search for the Free Will Project, you'll find, I think, about 8 of us in there right now. So we're small, but maybe we'll pick up some interesting voices along the way. If you're still watching, thank you so much. And I hope everyone has a beautiful day.
Yeah, thanks, Chet.